In this video, I will be performing a suite in D minor by Louis Couperin. As I have mentioned previously, Louis Couperin never published any of his music, and the two manuscripts that preserve his harpsichord works, namely the Boin manuscript and the Parville manuscript, do not arrange his pieces in the form of suites. In Boin, the pieces are arranged in order of ascending tonality. All the preludes appear first, and following the preludes, we have all the pieces in C major, then the ones in C minor, then D major, etc. Within each tonality, all dances of the same type also appear together. For instance, there are 4 courantes in C major, and they appear one after another, and following them there are 7 sarabandes in C major. Parville follows the same kind of ordering, except that the scribe included the preludes with all the other movements of the same tonality, and also mixed in pieces by other composers. So it is up to the performer to select a number of dance movements that belong to the same tonality and assemble them into a suite. When it comes to the key of D minor, there is a discrepancy in that there are quite a few dance movements, including several within a particular type. So for instance, there are several sarabandes, but there's only one unmeasured prelude. Clearly, such a large number of dance movements cannot be accommodated within one suite, and this one surviving prelude in D minor ends up being performed quite a lot. Obviously, a suite does not necessarily have to start with a prelude, but I decided to go for the alternative option that we find in the Parville manuscript, namely to use a prelude by another composer, or in this instance, to use an anonymous prelude in D minor that appears in the Parville manuscript and is included in the edition of Louis Couperin's works by Alan Curtis. Like the actual Louis Couperin prelude in D minor, this one also contains 3 sections, with the middle section being measured. Incidentally, this is the prelude I presented about 3 months ago, and I will put a link to that video in the video description. Alan Curtis suggests the possibility that this prelude could be either by Louis Couperin or Jacques Champion de Chambonnières. Clearly, matters of authorship can be very complicated, and I cannot explore the subject fully here. However, I don't think this prelude is by Louis Couperin. For one thing, in the unmeasured sections, I find the succession of ideas as well as the harmonic progressions a little too regular and orderly to be by Louis Couperin. Louis Couperin's preludes, just like his music in general, tend to contain a few more surprises and unexpected harmonic twists. Another aspect of this prelude that is a little different has to do with the middle section, whose polyphony never extends beyond 2-voice imitative passages, while the measured middle sections of Louis Couperin's preludes tend to involve 3 voices and usually commence with a stricter imitative passage that very much resembles fugal writing. Of course, I'm not trying to argue that this prelude is not as good as a prelude by Louis Couperin, but rather suggesting that it has different stylistic features. Let's look now at the individual movements. My perception of many 17th century Allemandes in minor keys is that they are permeated by an air of melancholy. In this Allemande, there is a particular expressive device that seems to amplify this melancholic effect. Generally speaking, the upper range for this piece reaches to this D, with 2 notable exceptions, both of them occurring at the beginning of each of the two main sections, where the melody line momentarily soars up to the a fifth above, before resigning itself and returning to the more somber realms of the lower registers. Let me show you what I mean. So this is the very opening of the Allemande. So there now we have reached the upper A, and then we are slowly going to start descending. And then in the beginning of the second section, we're going to have something similar again. We're going to start with an ascent to that high A. And you notice how we're slowly, the melody starts going down, and then eventually we're going to keep going a little further down the range of the harpsichord. The two courantes I have chosen work well as a pair because they contain a series of gestures that either complement each other or share common features. Let me show you what I mean. Let me get to the courantes for a moment. So the first thing to mention is that both pieces commence with an ascending upbeat leading to the tonic of D. So they both start like this. This is the first courante. And the second one, slightly different, but this remains the same. Now, in the first courante, the remainder of the first phrase has a short ascent up to F before gradually returning back to that A. Let me show you what I mean by that. So we start with the A, we go up to F. So we have this nice arch. We start from A, we go to F, and then go back to A. In the second courante, by contrast, the melody continues to ascend, soaring all the way to the A, an octave above. So this is now the second courante. The other gesture that I wanted to mention happens at the beginning of the second section, where both courantes have pretty much the same gesture, is just that it appears in different tonal centers. What I mean by this is that in the first courante, the second section starts in the relative major of F, so we have modulated from D minor to F major, which is, of course, a normal type of modulation. So we have this gesture there. And in the second courante, because it's a slightly longer work and the second section is a little longer, we haven't actually modulated to F major yet. It will eventually happen, but at that moment, in the beginning of the second section, we're still a little bit in the dominant of A. So but you can tell it's the same thing pretty much. So and then of course the left hand in both cases is imitating what we hear in the right hand. Another issue I would like to briefly address regarding the courantes has to do with the choice of tempo. In my previous video devoted to two courantes by Chambonnier, I mentioned that I am in the process of trying to play 17th century French courantes a little more slowly. I think this is a topic that deserves a more extensive clarification, and I plan to do that in a future video. Obviously, the reason I'm modifying my approach is because I think there is sufficient historical evidence to suggest that 17th century French courantes were not meant to be performed as fast as they normally are nowadays. But this change of approach requires a fairly thorough reconsideration of several aspects of interpretation, especially since it affects the character of the piece in a pretty fundamental way. This means that, at least the way I see it, I am still at a transitional stage, so the change of approach for the two courantes I'm performing in this video is still a fairly subtle one. What strikes me the most in terms of expressive content is how much more lyrical a courante can become when played at a slower tempo. And in order to emphasize this lyricism, I have to do a few things differently compared to what I did in the past. These changes include adopting more rhythmic flexibility, relaxing the amount of inégalité, and taking more time to savor the expressive high points of the piece. At the same time, it is also important not to lose sight of the dance elements in the piece. In other words, this more rhythmically flexible approach should not obscure the rhythmic identity of the dance itself. A distinguishing feature of both the Sarabande and the Chaconne is that neither of them start in the tonic. The Sarabande starts with an augmented chord built on the third scale degree of F. The chord itself is not necessarily unusual, it's just that pieces don't usually start that way. And let me show you what I mean. There's more than one way of looking at this augmented chord, by the way, but at least the way I hear it and the way I perceive it within this harmonic progression, I see it being built on the third scale degree. Now, the opening sounds like this. So the first chord is this one here. And what I'm suggesting is that really it's this chord here. So F, A, C sharp. And it kind of makes sense that way if you think of it that we go from this augmented chord built on the third degree of the scale, so an F. Then we go to a half diminished seventh chord on the second degree. And then to a dominant seventh. But again, as I said, this is at least how I hear it. Now, what is also interesting is that Louis Couperin tries to delay the arrival of the tonic as much as possible. The first time we actually get a tonic chord, it's on the third and therefore weakest beat of the measure, and it's also in second inversion, so it's really dependent on the dominant chord that follows it. So what happens, in other words, is this. Here's now the tonic in second inversion. There's the dominant. And then after this, we're going to get a proper tonic chord in root position. But it's taken us up to that point to actually get to this. And once you get here, you're going to start moving away from it again. And now we've gone to the relative major of F. The Chaconne is going to generate a different harmonic game, and exactly how that game works is really going to depend on how each of us chooses to hear the harmonic content. Before we look at that, let me briefly mention that the Chaconne follows the most common formal pattern of 17th century chaconnes, which is that of a refrain alternating with contrasting sections, usually referred to as couplets. In other words, it's a sort of rondeau form. In terms of the refrain, I think there is more than one way of looking at what is happening harmonically, so I want to leave that slightly open-ended. While the harmonic content is different from that of the Sarabande, I think the aim is similar in that Louis Couperin is once again trying to delay the arrival of the tonic for as long as possible. As I said before, it really depends on how one chooses to hear this, but one way of looking at the first measure is that we have a D major chord that serves as the dominant of the G minor chord that follows in the second measure. In other words, the opening D chord does not function like a major tonic, but is rather a secondary dominant. Let me show you what I mean by that. And by the way, for all of these examples, I'm kind of leaving out ornamentation and any sort of embellishment so that you can hear the harmonies better. So what is happening here is this. And I'm really looking at this. The D major chord. So we go from this as a secondary dominant to the G minor. The first proper D minor chord we get is on the first beat of measure 3, but similarly to what we saw in the Sarabande, it's in second inversion and therefore really part of the A major dominant chord that follows. In other words, this is what happens. So this is the tonic, let's say, D minor chord, but it's in second inversion, and then we actually are going to get a D chord, but it's actually a D major chord. So we kind of have a Picardy third ending. This means that the entire refrain does not contain a single D minor chord in root position. Another interesting moment occurs after the end of the third couplet, where we expect to go back to the refrain, and indeed we do, but surprisingly, it has been transposed up a fifth to A major. It is only after we have heard the entire refrain in A major that we hear it again, this time in its original tonal position of D. So if you remember, I played here, but after the end of the third couplet, we have this. And then we go, etc., etc. Finally, you can think of the Canaries as a kind of gigue, since both dance types have a very similar rhythmic profile. To me, this is the only movement in the suite that is playful and lighthearted. However, I also think the beginning of the second section introduces a brief lyrical interlude, and I try to emphasize it by playing the opening measures of the second section in a more sustained manner by minimizing the separation between notes. As for the score that accompanies the recording, I have used the Boin manuscript for all the dance movements. Since the prelude is only found in the Parville manuscript, which unfortunately is not available online, I only have the score from the modern edition of Louis Couperin's works by Alan Curtis. So this is the score you will see during the performance of the prelude. But after that, everything else will come from the Boin manuscript. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the performance. you.